So this is the last part of chapter 4 entitled Conducting Active Reconnaissance. So this is part 3. Vulnerabilities are weaknesses that may or may not be exploitable. Known vulnerabilities are categorized and referred to by their common vulnerabilities and exposure, also known as CVE number. Once you have discovered hosts and open ports, you can conduct a vulnerability scan to see if the services listening on those ports have known vulnerabilities. A vulnerability scan involves specially crafted packets or commands to the service to see how it responds. If the service is vulnerable to a specific attack, it will apparent it will be apparent in the response. Services that have been patched against the vulnerability will respond differently. Scanners can be more generalized or focus on specific targets, such as Linux servers or SQL servers or web applications or network devices. Depending on the tool, vulnerability scanners may or may not attempt to actually exploit the vulnerability and collect evidences of a successful exploit. Some tools allow you to select the target type. Some vulnerability scanners can use the output from a port scan to focus their efforts. I have here common vulnerability scanners. So we have OpenVAS, Nexpose, Retina Community, MBSA, Nessus. In the Cengage, you are to explore the Nessus. There's an activity for that. And then the Nmap, NSE scripts. Compliance scanning involves scans that verify that your network adheres to certain policy requirements. These policies can be mandated by law, industry, or individual company. Companies performing in-house compliance tests can use generic scanning tools to test their controls. Regulatory and industry compliance scanning, however, can be much more complex, with steep fines or even jail time for criminal non-compliance. For this reason, many organizations buy specialized software or even engage professional help when conducting regulatory compliance scans. Some organizations such as PCI, Security Standard Councils, these are for the credit cards, they publish a list of approved scanning vendors, and you can conduct vulnerability scans to assist with compliance testing. If the compliance is regulatory, check with your legal department to help determine the scope and depth required. Host vulnerability scans involve running tests against an operating system, including its default services. Often the focus is a single host. Hosts can not only run common network services, but they also often have specialized applications that use non-standard, dynamically chosen ports. Compromised hosts might also have malware backdoors listening on unusual ports. The challenge will be to map the discovered ports to the actual listening process. You cannot assume uh, that a well-known port is actually being used by the expected service. Most vulnerability scans do not require any type of credential. Some tools, however, can be configured to supply a username and password when performing a scan. This allows more privileged access and in some cases can yield better results. Scan that involves enumeration from a single host particularly benefit from using credentials. Additionally, certain exploits depend on the attacker logging in to be effective because the same credentials are often reused across a network. Many vulnerability scanning tools allow you to enter one or multiple possible credentials as part of the scan. Network services are common services you can expect to find on just about any network. So these services typically include the HCP. Some of these we have explored in Cisco and in network management like the HCP and DNS. Authentication directory services, you explored that in Active Directory in Netman. Then we have also the Wins, which is a legacy network service. Also email, file and print, web, FTP, fax, and remote access like Telnet and SSH. Vulnerabilities are normally associated with the product or implementation, but some are inherent in the actual process. The term server can refer to either a computer dedicated to serving clients. Okay, this is a device that serves or responds to the request of the client. Uh, or it may be a specialized application installed on a computer. Servers run operating systems that are configured to handle hundreds or even thousands of concurrent clients. Example of server operating system are Windows Server 2016 or Solaris or Ubuntu Server or a Red Hat Enterprise Server. These often ship with default network services installed. They also make it easy to install additional network service, including resource-intensive applications such as email and database servers. From vulnerability scanning perspective, there is no practical difference between a network service and a server service, since network services run on servers and servers provide their services on a network. When testing your server services, uh, when testing those, example, the server is a web server, you can start with a standard vulnerability scanner. If you have specialized services, you might need a tool configured for that service. Web servers and database provide a unique opportunity for vulnerability scanning. Although they often work together, they are actually separate services, each with its own vulnerabilities and listening ports. They are often installed on separate computers and have their own IP addresses. Web servers are often public-facing, whereas database servers are almost always on the private network. Take note of that. The web server will then have a back-end connection to the database server. Most database servers use the SQL language, and they usually listen to port 1433. That's the port of SQL. Okay, it may be 2CP or UDP. If you have access to the internal network, you can try scanning the SQL server directly. Or if your access is through the web server, you can try scanning the web application to see if it will pass illegal commands to the SQL server. In smaller applications, the web server and database can be part of the same application installed on the same computer. Along with well-known services, other types of application listen on the network. Some provide additional functionality to the standard service. One very common example is the web app. Web applications are scripts and executables that are included in the website's HTML. They provide dynamic content to the user and usually run on the website standard TCP port 80 and 443 if it's HTTPS. There are whole categories of web app vulnerabilities, but individual apps will behave differently from each other. An advanced pen tester might opt for testing for interesting behaviors by the web app, in addition to using a pre-scan vulnerability scan.